All right, let's turn now to our panel. Peter Kuznick is a history professor and the director of American University's Nuclear Studies Institute. Khalil Jahshan is the Palestinian American political analyst and the executive director of the Arab Center right here in Washington, D.C. And Michael Johns joins us from Pennsylvania. He's the co-founder and leader of the United States National Tea Party movement. Thank you to all of you for being with us. Michael Johns, let me start with you. We heard Ron Paul there accuse successive United States administrations of lying and going to war. In fact, the White House says it assassinated General Qasem Soleimani because he was planning an attack on U.S. assets. President Trump said that he was planning to blow up the United States embassy in Baghdad. But we've seen no evidence of that. Should we believe what the White House is saying? Are they lying?
Yeah, we should believe what the White House is saying, and not simply because the White House is saying it, but because we have 20 years of documented history of Soleimani's terrorist engagement throughout Iraq and throughout that entire region. He's responsible for the death of literally hundreds of thousands in Syria, responsible for much of the dilemma and challenges and war in Yemen, responsible in large part for the domestic suppression that has existed within Iran, and responsible most recently for the attack on the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad, following a whole series of other offenses against the U.S. and its allies. So he arrived in the Baghdad International Airport, in my judgment, to do his job. Let's ask, what is his job? I mean, he is not a diplomat. He is, a designated terrorist leader. And the administration learned very quickly upon his arrival there that he was designing mass undertaking of terrorist engagement against U.S. interests. And I think the issue of eliminating him from the battlefield is a no-brainer. I also dispute very heavily Ron Paul's position that we are in greater danger as a result of it. We have taken out one of the leading terrorists in the world with a regime that already was at war with U.S. and U.S. interests. Iran today is weaker than it was a week ago, and U.S. interests are safer and better protected than they were. I think also, finally, Ron Paul has served a very useful purpose in American dialogue, and I think many of his points are very well taken. His positions are very consistent with our founders. Thomas Jefferson warned that peace, commerce, and honest friendship with all nations, but entangling alliances with none. And he has reflected that. But we are in a real world with real threats and real evil, and I think we've been a reluctant participant for the most part since World War II, and many of these international engagements, the world over, by and large, would say that in the absence of U.S. leadership, very, very horrific developments and situations would have emerged for the purposes of freedom and global stability.
Khalil, there we heard that General Soleimani was planning massive terrorist actions against the United States and that he was planning to blow up the United States embassy in Baghdad. Do you think President Trump had any idea of who President Soleimani was and how his death would impact not just Iran, but the Middle East region?
Oh, I'm sure he did at one point or another. I mean, all these people surrounding him knew that. Soleimani is not a new figure. He has been known for decades. He has been one of this country's main enemies in the region. So, yes, his name, was not a household name in this country, but definitely people in politics knew who he was. I have a problem with this whole logic, though, in the sense that he is described as basically a terrorist. Look, I'm the last person on earth to defend Qasem Soleimani. He has participated, and his group has participated in acts of terrorism, domestic and international. That's beyond debate. But how do you define terrorism?
Exactly.
Okay, I mean, they keep saying, our colleague in Pennsylvania and others keep saying that he killed American soldiers. Since when killing soldiers is an act of terrorism? Terrorism, as we define it, whether it's academic or political, it is use of violence for political reasons against civilian targets, regardless of the identity of the perpetrator or the victim. Qasem Soleimani was not and as a professional military man in Iran, was not viewed as a terrorist by his country. He was viewed as a typical military leader with, of course, he had also a political role to play, and maybe much larger than life from our perspective, but that's an Iranian matter. And so, whether he was planning to do an event or not, I mean, with all due respect, I understand that President Trump keeps referring to himself as the sent one from God.
Yeah.
But I'm not sure he could read minds, with all due respect to him or to his God, for that matter.
Okay, Michael, a very quick response from you. Who's to define who a terrorist is and what terrorism is?
Well, let's start with the fact that the United Nations designated him as a terrorist. In fact, he should never have been in Iraq, according to the UN sanctions against him personally. He was there illegally. Number two, the EU's defined him as a terrorist. Number three, the US has defined him as a terrorist.
But who handed him in Iraq?
Let me answer that question.
Sure.
Yeah. It's wrong to say that he was exclusively engaged in hostilities with military targets. He hired a Mexican drug cartel to try to assassinate the Saudi ambassador in Washington. He was engaged in the killing of vast numbers of civilians in Syria that were perceived to strengthen that regime. He was engaged in the killing of vast civilians in Lebanon. This was an individual who had no problem terminating innocent human life if it advanced the interests of Iranians' objectives in those regions. And so his definition of it, the fact that it's questioned even, I think has shown that, Iran has done a good job globally in sort of developing a network of apologists. But for anyone who looks at it objectively, it's beyond dispute. He was arguably the leading terrorist in the world.
I need to move to Peter. Peter, both sides are saying that they don't want war, but in the United States, there seem to be contradictory messages here. On the one hand, President Trump says, well, okay, we're going to back off from this. Iran is standing down. Then a few days later, we hear White House officials saying, well, if any Iranian-backed militias attack United States assets in the region, we're going to hold Iran responsible for this. I mean, how does one explain this visceral hostility for Iran?
Well, the hostility for Iran goes back to 1953. It goes back to the overthrow of Mossadegh by the CIA in a coup. We have to remember the way the Iranians look at it. Mossadegh was enormously popular. He was Time Magazine Man of the Year in 1951. The U.S. ambassador in Tehran reported back to Washington that he had supported between 95 and 98% of the Iranian people. Yet we staged a coup to overthrow this popular, democratically elected president and replace him with the dictatorial Shah who ruled by Savak intelligence and torture. And in the U.S. policy, throughout this time, Iran has often, especially since 1979, been the target of U.S. enmity. In 1980, we supported Saddam Hussein against Iran when the Iraqis invaded Iran. We provided weapons, we provided intelligence, and then more recently, during the Bush administration, which Michael worked for, we said that Iran was part of the axis of evil. Iran was helping us at that point. And in 2003, Iran proposed a grand compromise in order to resolve the issues in the Middle East, to recognize Israel, to solve the crisis in the Middle East. And what did we do? Went the opposite direction. We drew up plans to invade Iran during that period. And so what we have now, and then if you look at the people in the Trump administration, the one thing they all agreed on was their hatred for Iran. Trump, when he fired Tillerson as Secretary of State, said, I was tired of having these constraints put upon me in going after Iran. Mattis, Secretary of Defense Mattis, had been forced out early by Obama as head of Central Command because he was such a hawk. He was so rabid when it came to Iran. And he was the adult in the room in the Trump administration. He was the one who was a restraining influence on Iran. So clearly there's been a faction, the Pompeos, the Pences, and Giuliani's and others who've been pushing for war with Iran. And at this point, this is a strategic disaster, what we've done there. I disagree completely with what Michael's saying.
Michael, I want to look at the broader question of the United States wars, what would have been called the endless wars that the United States have waged, especially in the last 20 years. It seems right now that there is no check on the president's ability to wage war, and that goes for any president in the last 2 decades. Insofar as the assassination of General Soleimani is concerned, this is what the Republican Senator Rand Paul had to say.
They have justified the killing of an Iranian general as being something that Congress gave them permission to do in 2002. That is absurd. That's an insult. And every time someone writes that Congress needs to take back their authority on war, that's what we're here to do. Let's have the debate, and let's have some senators stand up, and let's see if we can really, truly have a debate over who has the power to declare war.
So, Michael, is it time to put a limit on what a president can do in terms of going to war?
Well, there are limits, and that is that a declaration of war can only be made with the approval of Congress. Following 9/11, there was universal bipartisan consensus that the president needed the authority to act expeditiously when there were opportunities or key threats to U.S. interests, and legislatively, the very body that Rand Paul's a part of passed legislation that empowered the president. Now, if Congress is rethinking that, which I think would likely be a mistake at this point, but it's a legitimate debate, they need to take that up and repeal the legislation. And they have not done that. So there's no dispute under Article 2 and under the role of the commander-in-chief, and then under the legislative statute that President Trump acted completely legally in terminating Soleimani's
Khalil, clarify something for us here. Have we ever seen any evidence that Iraq threatened the United States, that Iraq posed a threat to the national security of the United States, that Iraq was involved in the 9/11 attacks before the United States invaded that country?
Absolutely not. And that was, again, a lie by the administration at the time. There is a consensus about that in Washington that was used, if you will, as an excuse to wage that war. Even those who participated in that war admit that today. There was absolutely no evidence that Iraq participated in the 9/11 accident.
Something else, if we look at that war, I mean, 2003, it's almost 20 years ago, Khalil, how would you assess the United States situation in the Middle East right now? How do you think the people of the Middle East see the United States?
Again, I mean, this is not a personal analysis as much as facts, borne by public opinion polls that we and others do conduct on a regular basis in the region. The U.S. is viewed as one of the top 2 most serious enemies for countries that are considered, by the way, on top of the U.S. list of allies.
Right.
And we're talking about 70 to 80 to even 90% in some countries do view the U.S. as a threat to their national security, including countries that, like we fought wars for, including Iraq, including Saudi Arabia, including the Emirates, and other countries. So despite all this effort, unfortunately, a mismanaged policy by this country for at least 60 or 70 years has produced a legacy, in essence, of misadventures, a legacy of misunderstanding, a legacy of violence. You mentioned Iraq. We occupied Iraq to make it a Jeffersonian democracy. And look at it today. Why are the young people of Iraq demonstrating today against U.S. and Iranian influence?
Right, okay. Peter, I want to get in a very quick question. I've got about 30 seconds left. The former U.S. commander, Andrew Besovich, who's now a teacher, he says that the professional military it no longer belongs to the people of the United States. It belongs to a national security establishment that uses it whenever it wants to, and that needs to change. People need to take ownership of the military in the future. Can you see that happening?
Well, we're nowhere near close to that now. But one of the good things that might come out of this is some popular uprising in the United States. According to the polling that's been done, USA Today poll, 55% of Americans say that we are less safe now after the hit on Soleimani. 24% say we are more safe. 21% say they don't know. So the American people are sick and tired of war. We've been at war. Nobody else does this. We've been at war for decades, and it's really time for us to end.
I'm sorry, we're going to have to leave it there. We've run out of time. Thanks to all of you. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.